Abraham and the promise of God. One more chapter, open up to Genesis chapter 25. We are going to read and talk about the final chapter in Abraham's story. And Abraham's story ends very similar to how your story is going to end. And you know what that is, right? It ends with a funeral. Abraham in Genesis chapter 25, we get to see Abraham take his final breath, and he's been through quite the story up to this point in time. And what we're gonna see with Abraham's story is that it's possible to struggle throughout life and still finish life well, to still finish life faithfully, because that's exactly what Abraham did. Now, I don't know how you want to finish life. I don't know if you ever thought much about what your funeral will look like. If there's maybe a word that you would describe your life with at your own funeral, what do you hope that word would be? What do you hope it would be? Maybe some people like loving or joyful or caring or giving or funny, whatever it happens to be. Typically that word has to do with other people, doesn't it? Our relationship with other people. We want to be known as people who have not just lived our lives for ourselves, but if you're like me, I want to be known as someone who lived my life for God, and I also want to be known as someone who lived my life for other people, that I loved God well and that I loved other people well. Well, we get to see what that looks like for Abraham. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 7 and 8, we actually get to see Abraham's obituary and how the author of Genesis describes Abraham through just a few words. This is what he says, verses 7 and 8. It says, "These are the days of the years of Abraham's life. 175 years Abraham lived." Holy cow, that's a long time, right? He drove that body all the way to the final breath. Verse 8, it says about his final breath, it says, "Abraham breathed his last, and he died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people." The word that the author uses here, the one word to describe Abraham that sticks out the most to me, is just the word full. Abraham lived a full life. If you live to be 175 years, that's pretty full in my book. That's as full as it gets. And Abraham, in those 175 years, it was a full life, but there was a lot of ups, there was a lot of downs. There was a lot of mountaintop experiences, and there was a lot of valleys that he had to go through. And if you've lived any time on this planet, you've likely experienced the same thing. But what we see about Abraham is that something transforms in him the further along in life that he gets. And what I want to do today is just look at the last few moments of his life and learn some things from Abraham. Two things specifically we're going to learn today about living by looking at how Abraham died. And so I want to look at those two things, but then I also want to give you two practical ways that you can live in a way that Abraham lived, and that you can start living that today and not have to wait until your old age and you've died. First thing is this: pass down the promise. That's what I would tell you. When I look at Abraham's life, what Abraham did really well, specifically near the end of his life, is he passed down the promise. He was given a promise from God, and then he passed that down to the next generation with his last breaths. In the next few verses in the chapter we're reading, verses 9 to 11, it says this. It says, "Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him." Now, this is interesting to me. Isaac and Ishmael, they are now old men by this point. They're in their 70s and 80s. They are now together from what appears to be the first time since they separated as young boys. And when they were teens, they were fighting and arguing with one another, and their families went separate ways. But there's something about the death of a loved one that brings families back together, isn't it? That you forget about the past, you forget about the strife, you forget about the argument, and all of a sudden, life is put into perspective. That something's bigger happening, that there's something that exists beyond just our tiffs with one another. Isaac and Ishmael, grown men by this point, they're married and they've become these grown men. They gather together to bury the thing that they have in common, their father, Abraham. And it says they buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittite. It goes on to say this. It says there Abraham was buried in that cave, and He was buried there with his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. Now, what I want to look at here in this verse here is it says that Abraham was buried in this cave, and he was buried there with his wife. Up to this point, we didn't get to cover it in the story, but Abraham's wife, Sarah, had passed away a few years before this. And in that passing, Abraham realized something. He hasn't owned any property yet. He's living in the land of Canaan, but he's living there as a wanderer, as a nomad. He set up tent, and he has a lot of people and a lot of possessions, but this land is still owned by the Canaanites and the Hittites. And when his bride passes away, he has to make a decision. Where do I bury her? Do I bury her in the land that we left many decades ago, or do I bury her in the land that we don't own yet? And so what Abraham does is he purchases this field. He goes to a Hittite and he asks him if he can just buy a plot of land, and they come to an agreement, and Abraham buys a lot of land, and on that lot of land, he buries his wife there. And then he dies, and his sons bury him next to Sarah. And here's what we begin to realize, that this promise that God made to Abraham, that he would have descendants and he would also have this land, the land hasn't come to fruition yet. In fact, when Abraham dies, the only plot of that land that he owns is the hole that he was buried in. That's what he inherited. But it goes on to say in that verse that after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac. God blessed Isaac after that. And so what we begin to see is that this inheritance is passed down to his son Isaac, and that's how it all started, right? In Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, we see that there was this intent with the promise that it wouldn't just be a promise in Abraham's hand, but it would be a promise that was passed down through the generation. That promise started whenever a few chapters before, at the beginning of this story, God looks at Abraham and says, Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Why was Abraham blessed? For his own benefit? No, he was blessed so that he can be a blessing to others. I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. And then I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. By the time Abraham's laid in that grave, all the families of the earth are not blessed. They're not blessed yet. That day is coming, but in order for that day to come, that blessing that Abraham inherited, that baton that he received from God, must be passed on to the next generation. And so what does he do? He passes it on to his son Isaac. It says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, which is the author's way of telling us that the story's not over. Just because Abraham is in the ground, the story's not over yet. We see how this story kind of culminates in Matthew chapter 1. We get this long genealogy that's 16 verses long, and we get to see this baton of faith passed from Abraham to the next generation. It says it goes from Abraham, who was the father of Isaac, and that baton of faith goes to Isaac, and then Isaac passes it to Jacob, his son, Jacob was the father of Judah, and then Judah was the father of who? Let me point it out to you. Judah, the father of, that's me, guys. That's me. I made the story. I made the Bible. Anybody else make the Bible? Okay. All right. So the baton gets passed to me. This proves to me that we Mexicans were around a long time. We are the blessing of God. The genealogy keeps going on, and it lists people like how it then gets passed down to David. It gets passed down eventually to a guy named Hezekiah, who is this great king. It gets passed to this guy named Josiah, and then we get to verse 16 in this genealogy where it says, and Jacob passes it down to his son Joseph, who was the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who was called the Christ. What we begin to learn about this promise is that the promise was bigger than Abraham. Abraham was not the blessing. Isaac, as it turns out, was not the blessing. That the descendant who would be a blessing to all the families of the earth would be someone who is yet to come. The person who, when God says, if you bless this person, I will bless you. if you curse this person, you will be cursed as well. That this is the person who is the promise. And when Abraham's story is ending, God's story is just beginning. And we see the culmination of that promise is the person of Jesus, just like we talked about last week, that the promise is not Isaac, the promise is not the land, the promise is not even just the Jewish nation, the promise is the son of Jesus who came through those elements. But then the promise doesn't even just stop with Jesus, because you keep reading the New Testament and you get to see that baton begins to be passed to other generations. You get to Acts chapter 2, verse 39, where it says, the promise is for you and for your children and for all who are far off, even those of us in the 21st century. It's for everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself, which means this: you're in there as well. Your name is there as well. That this promise was intended to be a blessing to you. That this baton that God passed along to Abraham, who passed it along to Isaac, who passed it along through his descendants, now sits in your hand today. Every single person who was called on the name of the Lord and believed in the Son of God, named Jesus the Christ, that blessing sits in their hand. Now let me ask you, what did Abraham do with that blessing? He passed it down. Let me ask you this: what are you doing with that blessing? What are you doing with that blessing? My fear is that some of us, we will go into the grave holding that baton, never having passed it down to our kids or their kids or to our friends or to our family or to our neighbors or the lost that are all around us. Can I tell you that the story and the promise of God is bigger than just your story and the promise that God made to you? Do not go into the grave holding the promise and the blessings of God. Pass those down to your kids. I know some of you are thinking, I don't have kids, I'm too young to have kids, or I've never wanted kids, or I've never had the blessing and the honor of having kids. Can I tell you this? It doesn't just have to go to your kids. Jesus did not have kids either. But what did he do? He passed it along to everybody around him. And the disciples did that, and the early church did that, and my prayer is that not just the early church does that, but the 21st century church does that as well. We love Jesus. We want to go to the grave with Jesus. But I hope we've also shared Jesus with those around us. So practically, what does that look like for you? It could look like a whole bunch of different things. But I want to give you one tool that you can use to pass down the promise of God this Christmas season. We're going to do a series, it's going to start in 2 weeks, that we're going to call Christmas at the Movies. And can I tell you, I'm really excited about this series because it's hard to talk about death, okay? I want to talk about something fun as well, okay? I want to talk about just the joy of Christmas, and there's something about Christmas that brings joy. And so in this series, we're going to have a lot of joy and fun in this series. You're going to come onto campus, and there's going to be popcorn available. There's going to be movie theater candy available. You're going to be able to take pictures and photo booths of some of the classic Christmas movies that you're watching this season and have a good time. But the thing that we're gonna do with this series is we're gonna look at some classic Christmas movies and we're gonna share a little bit of that story. And then I'm going to bridge from that story to the story of Jesus. And I want you to know this: I'm not doing it for your benefit, okay? I'm not doing it for you. I know you know the story of Jesus. You know who I'm doing this for? Your lost and wounded loved ones, your coworkers, your neighbors, your friends from school. What I want to do is I want to have a season where we can take a story that they are familiar with, and we can create a church atmosphere where they're going to feel incredibly uncomfortable stepping into because they haven't been to church in a long time or ever, and they're afraid that they're going to be judged or God's going to bring condemnation down upon them. And my hope is your lost and wounded loved ones are going to step through that door and they're going to see something familiar. And then they're going to hear a story that's familiar, that brings back this traditional Christmas feelings. And then what I'm going to do is take that story and bridge it to a story that matters, a story that gives them hope, a story that shares the good news of who Jesus is. Everybody in this Christmas season has a whole bunch of feelings that they're going through. And unfortunately, a lot of those feelings are feelings of pain. And I know someone who can heal those pains. And so what we're gonna do in this Christmas season is we're gonna take the baton that has been given to us in this church, the baton that's been passed down to us through this story of Abraham, and we're gonna bring hope to our lost loved ones. So what you should have received as you came in is this movie ticket. Here, hopefully everybody got one. If you did not get one, make sure you grab one from our section hosts on the way out. And what these are invites to the Christmas at the Movies series. And what I want you to do is to give this to someone else. Don't put this in your car and forget about it. Don't leave this in your bedroom and forget about it. This is not to be meant to stay in your hands. It's meant to be passed along to someone else. On the bottom of it, there's a perforated ticket they can rip off and redeem for a free concession stand snack when they get here, and so they can get a free item from our cafe. But my hope is that you will give this to someone who doesn't know Jesus and have the courage to pass down what has been given to you, an opportunity to hear about Jesus in a church that loves Jesus and loves people. Can you do that this Christmas season? I hope you do that. I hope everybody will give one, but some of you, I know you are evangelistic and you're like, I got a whole team of people I'd love to invite. I got a whole class of people, a whole workspace of people I want to invite. Make sure you grab more of those from our section hosts as well. That's how you can pass down practically what has been passed down to you in this Christmas season. One of the other things that we see in Abraham's life is he didn't just pass down the promise, but he did something else that I think is really interesting and that stands out in this passage to me. And it's something that I hope that we do as well. And it's this. I hope that we do our giving while we're living. Harvester, will you do your giving while you are living? I know that there's so many of you who are generous, but here's what I also know about us. Some of us, if we're honest, we're a little bit of a Scrooge, right? We're a little bit of we like to hold on to our things, and we're gonna stock everything up, and then many of you are gonna die with full barns. Here's the reality about generosity. Every single one of you will be generous, and you don't get to choose whether you're generous or not, okay? Everybody will be generous. Some of you are naturally that way, and you are being generous right now. Some of you are going to give everything away when you go into the grave. Because there's coming a time when you will give everything away. And so the decision you have to make is, am I gonna do my giving while I'm living? Or am I going to die and then the government gets to choose where all my things go? Or my relatives get to fight over where all my things go? What I love about Abraham's story is that he did his giving while he was living. A few verses before, verses 7 and 8 that we just read, is verses 1 to 6. And it says this about Abraham. It says, Abraham took another wife. Now, some of you didn't know that. Some of you have never heard of Keturah, but Abraham did get married again after Sarah had passed away. Sarah passes away and he buries her. And then later in life, he remarries. And then this is what happens. Keturah bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Median, Ishbak, and Shua. All of these were the children of Keturah. And so we get this picture where Abraham, he remarries, and then all of a sudden, God begins to just bless him with child after child after child after child, which I think is just God's way of laughing with Abraham. Like for 100 years, you were fatherless, and then you got one, and now at the end of your life, baby, 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 baby. It's like the overflow of blessings of God. Abraham, he received so much from God. And now all of a sudden, he gets these children as well. But then it goes on to talk about how he gave to his kids. In verse 5, it says, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. He gave it all. He gave it all up to his Isaac while he was living. And then it goes on to verse 6, but to the sons of his concubines, which was Keturah, was one of those, it says, Abraham gave gifts. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. So Abraham, he gets these gifts, or he gives these gifts to Isaac, and Isaac receives these gifts from his father. He receives this land. He's gonna receive this inheritance called Israel. And then also the sons of Keturah receive gifts, and Abraham sends them to other countries and other lands for them to have land as well. Now, what we know about Abraham's life up to this point is that Abraham's life wasn't easy. For sure, you couldn't describe his life as easy. But he gets to the end of his life, and he was blessed. It wasn't easy, but it appears that God blessed him. You know, if I were to break Abraham's story up into three parts, here's the three parts I would say about his story. First is that Abraham left everything. And then Abraham gained everything. And then what we read here is that Abraham gave everything. Abraham's story starts off with God saying, I need you to leave it all behind. Leave your family behind. Leave your hometown behind. And go to this place I will show you. And just trust me when I'm asking you to leave everything behind. And in the midst of Abraham's journey, and even in the struggles and the mountaintops and the valleys, every story along the way seems to end with God adding another blessing onto Abraham's life. And then another blessing onto Abraham's life. And then another blessing. And then he adds Isaac onto Abraham's life. And then Keturah comes and he has kid after kid after kid. And it seems like everything Abraham ever wanted, he now has. And as he's looking to this God who is being known as a giver now, as a provider now, Abraham decides that he's going to follow in God's footsteps, and he gives everything as well. And so I got to ask myself, how is Abraham so generous? Why is Abraham so generous? It's because he's experienced the generosity of God, and he wants to be like him. He wants to be like him. And here's what Abraham learns throughout his life, especially in the latter years, that I know that he wished he would have grabbed a hold of in the younger years. He begins to learn this, that the person who gives is never without. The person who gives is never without. Abraham, all of a sudden, later in life, he becomes generous. There's a few stories that we haven't been able to cover about his generosity when Melchizedek comes along, and his generosity to Lot, and his generosity to the people in even Sodom and their families. And there's this generosity that begins to overflow in him. And then he gets to the end of his life, and he just decides, I'm gonna give it all away. Before I die, I'm giving it all. I'm not gonna wait until I'm in my grave, and then my kids have to figure out what's theirs. I'm just gonna give it all away right now. And he begins to learn that the person who gives is never without. Earlier in his life, what was he doing? He was holding on to everything he had. He was afraid to give it up to God. And he began to realize that those who hold on to go through the most painful times. But those who are generous, they begin to learn something about who God is. Abraham gave everything, and then he dies. And how does the obituary describe him? Full. Full. Let me go back to that line about Abraham. It says, Abraham died in a good old age, an old man and full of years. Knowing what we know about Abraham, that he died at 175, we read full of years as if to say that the author is measuring the quantity of his life, that he was full of years. 175, I think we would say that is full of years. But the heart of the author and the intent of the author is not to quantify his life, it's to qualify the years of his life. It's to say those 175 years, he made the most of them. Some translations, they'll actually translate this, not full of years, they'll translate it, he was satisfied with life. That he was able to look over those years and come to the conclusion that, man, that was filling to me. That filled me up to go through. The mountaintops filled me up. The valleys, with a perspective, hindsight, it filled me up, and I learned something about God. And now in my old age, as I look at my son and what's coming around the corner for him, I just want to give, and I just want to bless, and I just want to see God multiplied in this. And so Abraham, what's he do? He gives everything he had. What I love about his life, it appears that he drove that body as far as it would go. Some of you, that's what you're doing with your cars, aren't you? You're like, I'm gonna keep driving this car, see how many miles we can put on this car until it eventually stops on the side of the highway, right? That's what Abraham did with his life. He drove that life as far as it could go. He drove it through blessings. He drove it through hardships. He drove it to his final breath. And then when that car reached the end of the road, Abraham looks down at the fuel gauge and it still reads full. Man, do you want that for your life? How do you imagine pulling up to the last breath of your life? Do you want to be on full or do you want to be on empty? The paradox is the only way to end on full is to push that gas pedal down as far as it'll go and to give instead of holding on to. Here's the question I would ask as we wrap up. Will you give while you live? Will you give while you live?